Harlan's anger filled the room like a storm. Caleb, trembling, stood in front of his baby brother Silas, tiny hands raised, voice breaking. "Please, don't hurt us, Daddy." Silas clutched his brother's arm, eyes wide with fear, as the mansion seemed to hold its breath. Could a little boy's courage really stop a storm of rage? Could love survive in a house ruled by fear? Before we dive into this emotional journey of courage, hope, and transformation, make sure to follow the channel so you don't miss stories that touch the heart and inspire the soul. Behind the tall iron gates, where ivy curled like secrets no one dared to speak, stood a mansion of glass and marble. From the outside, it was breathtaking, the kind of house people slowed their cars to admire, whispering to themselves, "Who must live there?" But inside, the silence was not peace. It was heavy, suffocating, pressing down on every surface like an invisible weight. Chandeliers sparkled, portraits stared down with frozen smiles, but no laughter, no warmth, no melody of family filled those endless halls. 5-year-old Caleb moved through those corridors as though he were trespassing in his own home. His little feet tiptoed across the polished floors, every step measured, every breath shallow, afraid the creak of a board or the clink of a glass might awaken the storm. His small hands often pressed against the walls, as if touching something solid might steady the trembling in his chest. Caleb was far too young to understand the language of grief, but he knew the language of fear. His heart raced at the sound of footsteps, his stomach clenched at the echo of his father's voice. He carried on his tiny shoulders a burden that didn't belong to him, the burden of shielding someone even smaller, even more fragile. His baby brother, Silas, only 9 months old, had become his mission, his reason to stay strong. Their mother was gone. She had left the world the moment Silas entered it, leaving behind 2 boys and a man whose soul had shattered into something unrecognizable. From that day forward, Harlan, their father, the man people in business magazines called a visionary CEO, was no longer a father at all. His love had withered, replaced by a coldness so sharp it cut deeper than any blade. His words were commands, his tone was ice, and his anger was fire waiting to consume. At night, when the house grew so quiet that even the ticking of the grand clock seemed deafening, Caleb would press his palms against the bars of Silas's crib. His voice was small, trembling, yet determined. "Don't cry, Silas," he whispered, leaning close so only the baby could hear. "If Daddy hears you, he'll be mad. Please, please, just stay quiet." His throat tightened as he spoke. Sometimes his lips quivered so badly he had to bite down to keep from sobbing. His brown eyes glistened with unshed tears, but he forced them back, afraid his crying would wake the baby. He would smile, a shaky, broken smile, because even at 5 years old, Caleb believed he had to be strong for his brother. There were moments when Silas's tiny fists would reach out, brushing against Caleb's fingers. The baby's skin was warm, soft, fragile. In those seconds, Caleb felt both the crushing weight of responsibility and the spark of courage that was slowly forming inside his fragile heart. It was as if Silas, without words, was telling him, "Don't give up. I need you." The mansion was filled with chandeliers, but none of their light could touch the darkness that wrapped around the family. The marble floors gleamed, but they reflected nothing of love. Caleb often pressed his ear against Silas's crib, listening to the soft rhythm of his baby brother's breathing. Each exhale was proof that he hadn't failed yet, proof that he was still protecting him. Sometimes, when the fear grew too big to hold, Caleb whispered to himself, almost like a prayer, "Mommy, if you can hear me, please help me. Please make Daddy love us again." But the silence never answered. Still, deep within that tiny chest that hurt with fear, something remarkable was happening. Courage was quietly blooming, like a stubborn flower pushing through cracks in the concrete. Caleb didn't know it yet, but every time he stood by Silas's crib, every time he whispered comfort despite his own trembling, he was shaping himself into someone extraordinary. Because courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is a child's voice whispering, "Don't cry. I'll protect you," even when his knees shake, his throat aches, and his world feels like it's collapsing. And though love seemed absent within those cold walls, something stronger than silence was beginning to grow. The bond of two brothers, bound by loss, bound by fear, but above all bound by a hope that refused to die. The morning the door opened for Naomi, the mansion itself seemed to exhale, as though it had been holding its breath for far too long. For years, the air inside had been stale, heavy with unspoken grief and anger. But when she stepped across the marble threshold, something invisible shifted, so subtle that no one could name it, yet so powerful it began to ripple through every corner. Naomi was 32 years old, her skin a deep, beautiful brown, her eyes steady like the earth itself. She carried no jewelry, no designer bag, no air of power, yet her very presence felt stronger than the walls of glass and marble towering around her. She had walked through storms in her own life, and though her clothes were simple, her soul carried a quiet strength that no luxury could imitate. Caleb noticed her the moment she entered. He stood half-hidden behind the stair banister, his little fingers gripping the polished wood until his knuckles turned white. His stomach tightened, his chest heavy, as though danger had entered. In his short life, adults had never brought safety. They brought shouting, punishment, or cold indifference. His big brown eyes followed Naomi cautiously, darting from her steady footsteps to the way she carried herself without fear. Naomi did not look at him directly at first. She had learned in years of caring for children that trust was not given freely in homes where silence ruled louder than love. Instead, she allowed her presence to fill the room naturally. She moved with calm purpose, not rushing, not forcing. She adjusted curtains to let in a little more light. She placed her bag quietly in a corner, her movements soft and respectful, yet sure of themselves. And then it happened. 9-month-old Silas, restless in his crib, let out a small whimper. His tiny fists waved in the air, his face crumpling as though tears were ready to spill. Caleb froze, panic striking his little body like lightning. His pulse raced, his throat constricted. He knew what crying led to. He knew the storm that followed. He wanted to run, to hush his brother, to protect him before it was too late. But before Caleb could move, Naomi did. She leaned down, scooping Silas gently into her arms. Her embrace was natural, as though she had known him all his short life. And then her voice, a soft hum, tender and low, filled the cold air. A lullaby. It wasn't the words that mattered. It was the warmth. The melody seemed to weave itself into the baby's heartbeat, calming him instantly. Silas's cries dissolved into soft giggles, his chubby hands clutching at Naomi's blouse as if he had found what he had been searching for all along. His dark eyes sparkled with a joy Caleb couldn't remember ever seeing before. The sound pierced through the silence like sunlight breaking storm clouds. Caleb's small mouth parted in shock. His body froze mid-step, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure someone could hear it. His brother, his always restless, always crying brother, was laughing in the arms of an adult. Caleb's mind spun with disbelief. How? Why her? Why now? Silas cooed, pressing his cheek against Naomi's shoulder, as if he had finally discovered safety. Caleb's throat tightened. A hot sting burned behind his eyes, and he bit down hard on his lip to stop the tears. He hadn't seen happiness like this since before everything had changed, before his mother's absence hollowed the house into an echo of itself. Naomi glanced at Caleb then, not with questions, not with pity, but with understanding. She noticed the way his small chest rose and fell too quickly, the way his tiny fists clenched by his sides, the way he seemed ready to run or cry but refused to do either. She didn't rush toward him, didn't ask him to come closer. She simply held Silas with gentle steadiness, and allowed her kindness to speak louder than any words. Hours passed that day, but Caleb could not shake what he had seen. His world had been built on rules of survival. Don't cry, don't make noise, don't hope. And yet, here was someone who had broken all those rules simply by existing. At dinner, the tension remained. Harlan's shadow loomed, his voice sharp, his demands exacting. But Caleb found himself stealing glances at Naomi, who moved silently yet confidently, setting dishes, pouring water, watching without judgment. There was something unexplainable about the way she stood in the room, as if she carried a lantern in a house that had long forgotten light. That night, when Caleb tucked Silas into his crib, he whispered more softly than usual. "You liked her, didn't you?" His voice trembled, almost jealous, almost afraid. "You smiled. You never do that with me. Maybe she's different. Maybe." He stopped, his throat closing with a knot he couldn't untangle. Naomi, standing nearby but pretending to busy herself with folding linens, caught every word. Her own chest tightened. She had walked into many homes before, cared for many children, but something about this one was different. This house was not just lonely, it was wounded. And these boys were not just children. They were survivors of a storm they should never have faced alone. She whispered back, though not directly at him, as if speaking into the air. "Sometimes the world feels colder than we can bear, but even the smallest flame can change the night." Caleb's eyes flicked toward her, unsure if she had meant it for him. But in that moment, something inside his fragile heart stirred. Hope had quietly walked in, and though no one could see it yet, the story of this house was beginning to change. Dinner in the mansion was never just a meal. It was a battlefield in disguise. The table stretched endlessly, covered in polished silverware, crystal glasses, and dishes that looked like they belonged in magazines. But beauty meant nothing here. The air was sharp, suffocating, heavy with rules unspoken but deeply feared. Every clink of a fork against porcelain echoed like thunder in Caleb's small ears. He sat at the table, legs barely reaching the chair's edge, his little shoulders stiff as stone. His tiny hand shook as he reached for his glass of water. The stem slipped under his trembling fingers, and in that one instant, everything shattered. A splash of water fell onto the spotless white tablecloth, spreading like a stain of shame. The room froze. Harlan's chair scraped back, the sound slicing through Caleb's chest like a blade. The CEO's voice thundered, deep and merciless. "Careless. Do you want to embarrass me?" Caleb's body jolted as though struck. His heart pounded so hard it hurt, his stomach twisting into painful knots. He wanted to disappear, to melt into the chair, to be invisible. Tears welled in his eyes, but he forced them back, terrified that crying would only bring more rage. His little fingers clutched the edge of the table, nails digging into the wood, trying to steady the storm inside him. Silas, in his high chair, whimpered at the sound of his father's anger. Caleb's eyes darted instantly toward his baby brother, fear surging like electricity. "Don't cry, Silas. Please don't cry," he begged silently. His throat tightened with a knot so heavy it felt like swallowing rocks. And then something unexpected. Across the table, Naomi's gaze found him. She didn't speak. She didn't scold. She didn't rush to clean the water. She simply looked at him. Her eyes were steady warm, filled with something Caleb had never seen directed at him before: safety. A smile touched her lips, not wide, not forced, just gentle, reassuring. It was as if her gaze wrapped around him like an invisible blanket. She was saying without words, "You're not alone. I see you. You're safe with me." For a moment, Caleb's shaking slowed. The knot in his throat loosened just enough for him to breathe. He lowered his gaze quickly, afraid his father would notice, but the feeling remained like a flickering flame inside him. Someone was on his side. Someone had chosen him, not out loud, not with grand gestures, but with quiet presence. The rest of dinner was a blur. Caleb kept his head down, chewing food he couldn't taste, his stomach too tight to swallow properly. Harlan continued eating, muttering under his breath about weakness and mistakes, his jaw tense with silent fury. But Caleb held on to that glance, that smile from Naomi, like a lifeline. Later that night, the house grew silent again. Chandeliers dimmed, footsteps faded, and shadows stretched across the marble floors. Caleb curled under his covers, knees pulled tight against his chest. His small body shook with the sobs he had buried during the day. He pressed his face into the pillow, muffling the sound so no one would hear. But Naomi did. From the hallway, she caught the fragile whisper that slipped through the cracks of the night. Caleb's voice, small, broken, trembling. "Don't hurt us, please." The words pierced her chest like shards of glass. Her throat tightened, eyes burning as tears welled unbidden. She placed a hand against the doorframe, steadying herself, fighting the urge to break down right there. This wasn't just fear. It was the cry of a child who had carried too much for too long. She whispered into the silence, though softly, so he might not even know she was there. "You're not alone anymore, Caleb. Someone is listening now." Inside the room, Caleb's sobs quieted as though, somehow, his heart had heard. He wiped his cheeks with the back of his hand, his chest still aching. A sliver of calm entered the storm. For the first time in his young life, he felt a strange, fragile truth. Someone had listened. Not dismissed, not silenced, not punished. Listened. Naomi leaned her head against the wall, closing her eyes as a vow formed in her heart. No child should carry this weight. I won't let him carry it alone anymore. And though nothing had changed yet on the outside, though Harlan's anger still loomed, though the mansion's silence still reigned, something irreversible had begun. Because when someone finally listens, even the heaviest chains of fear start to crack. The mansion was a kingdom built on silence, and silence had rules. Children were to be seen, never heard. Smiles were to be hidden, never shared. And warmth was dangerous. Warmth meant defying the chill that Harlan, the master of the house, demanded from everyone around him. Naomi knew these rules the moment she arrived, though no one spoke them out loud. She could feel them pressing against her skin like invisible chains, suffocating and heavy. Yet, quietly, she began to bend them. At bedtime, instead of leaving Caleb alone with his fear, she sat beside his bed. Her voice, soft and steady, spun stories of heroes and kingdoms, of children who faced monsters and discovered that courage lived inside their own hearts. Caleb's eyes would widen, his little chest rising and falling as he hung onto every word. Sometimes his lips would curve into a shy smile, so faint it could vanish in an instant, but it was there. With Silas, Naomi's arms became home. She rocked him gently, humming lullabies as though he were her own flesh and blood. The baby's restless cries softened, his tiny fingers curling around hers, his body melting into calm. For the first time since their mother's death, the mansion felt alive. But not everyone welcomed this change. Harlan noticed. His eyes, cold as winter glass, followed Naomi whenever she lingered near the children. He watched the way Caleb's posture softened in her presence, the way Silas laughed instead of screamed, and deep inside, something twisted. Rage, jealousy, fear. Because every smile, every laugh, every drop of warmth reminded him of what he had lost and what he had tried to bury. One evening, as the sky outside burned with the last hues of sunset, the storm broke. The children were in the nursery. Naomi sat on the floor with Caleb, stacking wooden blocks into towers that wobbled dangerously but made him giggle. Silas, in her lap, babbled happily, his chubby hands clapping with delight. For a brief, fragile moment, joy filled the room. Then the door swung open. Harlan's tall figure filled the doorway, his presence sucking the air from the room. His jaw was tight, his fists clenched, his voice like a blade slicing through the fragile peace. "You're getting too close," he spat. "Pack your things or you're done here." Caleb's world collapsed in an instant. His body froze, his heart plummeting into his stomach. His throat closed with panic, and then he moved. Tears burst from his eyes as he scrambled to his feet, rushing toward his father. His small hands clutched Harlan's sleeve with all the desperation of a drowning child clinging to driftwood. "Don't take her away," he cried, his voice cracking under the weight of his terror. "Please, Daddy. Please. We need her." His little chest heaved, sobs shaking through his thin frame. His fingers gripped tighter, his knuckles white, as though letting go meant losing the last piece of safety he had ever known. Naomi's heart twisted. Every instinct screamed to pull him back, to shield him from the storm, but she knew this moment was bigger than her. This was Caleb's first act of courage. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't whispering. He was standing, raw, trembling, desperate, but standing nonetheless. Harlan's face hardened, his eyes narrowing with fury. Yet Naomi did not flinch. She rose to her feet, spine straight, shoulders squared, meeting his glare with eyes steady as stone. Her voice was calm, but beneath the calm was steel. "If you want me gone, then say it. But understand this, your children are not machines. They need more than food and walls. They need love. They need someone to stay." For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Harlan's nostrils flared, his fist shaking as if he were holding back an eruption. Caleb's tears fell hot and fast, soaking into his father's sleeve. His sobs echoed in the silence, the sound of a little boy begging for something bigger than himself. Naomi's chest burned, her stomach tight with fear, but she did not back away. She stood tall, steady, her eyes locked on Harlan's, refusing to yield. In that moment, courage wasn't loud. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a fight. It was quiet, fierce, unshakable. And it lived in both of them. In Caleb, who dared to plead when fear told him to stay silent. And in Naomi, who dared to stand firm when power demanded she bow. The room was heavy with tension, but something had cracked. Something in Harlan's eyes flickered, not change, not yet, but conflict. The storm inside him had been challenged. Naomi reached down, resting a gentle hand on Caleb's shoulder. Her touch steadied his trembling. Her voice, soft but resolute, spoke to him, though her eyes never left Harlan. "You don't have to fight alone anymore, Caleb. I'm here. I'm not afraid of him." Caleb's sobs slowed. His chest still heaved, his cheeks wet with tears, but in his wide, shining eyes, a spark had ignited. For the first time in his life, he had felt what it meant to fight back, not with fists, but with truth. And though Harlan's words remained sharp, though his anger still lingered like smoke in the air, the power of silence had been broken. Because courage, once spoken, can never be silenced again. Late one night, the mansion felt different, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Shadows stretched across the corridors, dancing in the flickering light of a single lamp. The world outside raged with rain and wind, but inside, a quieter storm was brewing, a storm of truth, long buried and heavy with guilt. Naomi moved silently, carrying a basket of freshly folded laundry, but her mind was elsewhere. She had heard things before, whispers, broken sentences, words that didn't make sense until tonight. Something in the air pulled her toward Harlan's office, a force she could not ignore. She approached the large oak door, its polished surface reflecting the dim light. Through the glass panels, she saw him, Harlan, alone, hunched over his desk. His face was pale, drawn tight with something beyond anger. He clutched a photograph, his knuckles white, his eyes wet with memories he had never allowed to surface. Her heart tightened. She had seen rage, she had seen power, but this was grief that had turned to stone. She stepped closer, careful to remain unnoticed, yet her presence seemed to awaken him. He did not look up at first, lost in a memory only he could see. And then the words came low, trembling, but sharp enough to cut through the night. She died because of him, because of that child. The sentence struck Naomi like ice. She froze, the basket slipping from her hands. Her chest tightened, a cold fire racing through her veins. Her throat closed as she tried to process the meaning. Silas, the baby. Harlan's grief had twisted into blame. The weight he had carried for years, he had heaped it unknowingly onto the smallest shoulders in the house. She stepped forward, her voice firm but trembling with emotion. "Your children don't need a CEO," she said, each word deliberate, sharp like a scalpel cutting through layers of denial. "They need a father." Harlan's head snapped up. His eyes, wide with shock, glistened with the faint sheen of unshed tears. His jaw clenched, his fist shaking as though trying to crush the words Naomi had spoken. Pain, confusion, and fury collided in his gaze. Caleb, asleep in his room just a few floors above, could never have imagined the weight of secrets hidden beneath his father's calm exterior. Silas, dreaming quietly in his crib, had no knowledge of the invisible chains he had carried from birth, the silent accusation that he had somehow caused the loss of their mother. Naomi took a cautious step closer. Her heart pounded like a drum, her stomach twisting into a knot that burned with both fear and determination. She forced herself to meet his gaze. "You've been punishing them for something that isn't their fault," she continued, her voice steady despite the quake in her chest. "You've let your grief become their cage. It's time to set them free, and maybe yourself too." Harlan's breathing was uneven. The storm inside him waged war between pride, sorrow, and the faintest flicker of recognition. His eyes darted away, unable to face the truth, yet unable to turn from it either. He had spent years building walls around himself, around the children, around the grief that swallowed him whole. And now, Naomi had chipped at the foundation of those walls with nothing but courage and words that refused to be silenced. He spoke, but the sound was rough, jagged, almost a whisper. I did it for her. I did it because I thought it would protect them, protect him." Naomi's chest ached. She knew the truth now, the way guilt had poisoned every interaction, every harsh word, every moment of absence. Harlan had tried to protect them, but in doing so, he had become the source of fear. "You can protect them without punishing them," she said gently. Her eyes softened, but the fire within them did not fade. "You can be the father they need. You can start now." For a long moment, the office was silent except for the rain lashing against the windows and Harlan's ragged breathing. His fingers trembled as they brushed across the photograph he held. Memories of his wife, of Caleb as a tiny boy, of Silas's first cries, all collided in his mind, a mixture of love and loss he could no longer deny. The truth had a weight, and it pressed on him like the walls of a coffin. But for the first time, he realized the chains he had built around his children were not theirs to bear. They were his own. Naomi stepped closer, careful to offer strength without intrusion. Her voice softened, carrying both compassion and unwavering conviction. "It's never too late to change, to love, to forgive yourself. Let them in, Harlan. Let them see you as their father, not just a storm they cannot escape." Harlan's hand shook, the photograph slipping from his grasp. He sank into the chair, burying his face in his palms. For years, he had believed that hiding behind anger and authority would protect him and his children. Now, faced with the truth, he realized that all it had done was isolate them and himself. Tears, long restrained, finally broke free. Hot, unrelenting, a mixture of sorrow and regret. Naomi did not speak, she did not move. She let him feel it, the full weight of a lifetime of guilt and grief. And in that silence, something remarkable began to stir. Awareness, vulnerability, the faintest whisper of transformation. Somewhere upstairs, Caleb stirred in his sleep, his small face creasing in a dreamless frown. Silas cooed softly, unknowing, yet safe for the first time in months. The mansion, once cold and echoing with fear, seemed to hold its breath. Something was shifting. Because the secret had been revealed, and truth, once spoken, has the power to shatter walls or build bridges. Naomi stood tall, her chest heaving with adrenaline, knowing she had planted the seed of change. She could feel it in the room, in the air, in the first tremors of hope flickering in Harlan's eyes. This house, this family, could finally begin to breathe again. And even in the darkest nights, even in the heaviest storms, sometimes one courageous act of truth can ignite the light that was hidden for far too long. The storm outside mirrored the storm inside the mansion. Rain lashed against the windows like furious hands, wind howling through the eaves, rattling the panes with a relentless urgency. Caleb's small body trembled as he tried to sleep, curled tightly under his covers, his mind racing with memories of shouting, punishment, and the silent weight of fear he carried daily. Tonight, though, the air felt different. An undercurrent of tension ran through the halls, heavier than the usual quiet that Harlan demanded. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs, sweat prickling the back of his neck, cold fear intertwining with a strange sense of foreboding. His small hands clenched the sheets, nails biting into the fabric, as a familiar voice thundered down the hallway. Caleb. It was Harlan. The sound made the walls shiver, the floor vibrate beneath the weight of authority and rage. Caleb's stomach twisted, a knot of fear and desperation rising to his throat. He leapt from the bed, rushing toward Silas's crib. The baby stirred, sensing his brother's panic, tiny arms waving, lips trembling as though he understood the danger that approached. Caleb's knees shook as he stood in front of the crib, his small body a shield between Silas and the storm that was Harlan. His chest rose and fell rapidly, adrenaline coursing through his veins like fire. "Don't hurt us, Daddy," he cried, voice cracking, raw with fear and determination. "Please, don't hurt us." The words echoed through the room, each syllable a fragile bridge of courage stretching between his trembling form and his father's towering presence. Caleb's body quivered violently, his eyes shining with unshed tears, his lips trembling as he continued to plead. Harlan's breath hitched. His eyes widened, not with anger this time, but with something he had not felt in years, shock. The sight before him, his 5-year-old son standing, trembling yet unbroken, demanding safety, cut through the armor he had built around himself. And then Naomi burst into the room. Her chest heaving, heart pounding, adrenaline fueling her every step. She had heard the boy's desperate cry from down the hall, felt the urgency in the air as though it were a living entity. Her feet barely touched the floor as she crossed the distance, and she stood beside Caleb, not shielding him with her body but lending him the strength of her presence. "Enough," she shouted, voice firm, unwavering, cutting through the storm. "You will not terrify them. Not tonight. Not ever again." Her words hung in the air like a command, heavy with authority, tempered with care. Harlan froze, caught between fury and the unbearable weight of truth. His gaze fell upon Caleb, small and fragile, yet impossibly brave. The image of his son, eyes wide with fear yet shining with courage, struck him deeper than any reprimand or boardroom conflict ever could. Silas's eyes met Harlan's, tiny and innocent, reflecting the same vulnerability Caleb had shown. The baby cooed softly, clutching the crib's railing, unaware of the storm but sensing the shift. For the first time, Harlan truly saw them, not as extensions of his grief or failures, not as reflections of his anger, but as living beings, whole and deserving of love. Time seemed to slow. The wind outside battered the mansion with relentless fury, rain dripping from the eaves, yet inside, the world held its breath. Harlan's fists, previously clenched so tight they whitened the knuckles, relaxed slightly. His jaw, rigid for so long, loosened as if the sight of his children had cracked the stone encasing his heart. Naomi stepped closer, her eyes locked on Harlan's. She did not flinch, did not bow. She simply radiated calm strength, a beacon amid the tempest. "They are your children," she said, her voice low but unwavering. "And they are terrified of losing you, not because you are strict, but because they are afraid of your anger. Let them feel safe. Let them feel love." Caleb, still trembling, pressed a hand against his chest, feeling it pound like a drum. He realized in that terrifying and yet profoundly powerful moment that courage was not the absence of fear. It was standing up even when fear tried to pin you to the floor. He met his father's gaze, eyes shining with unshed tears and unyielding resolve. Harlan's face contorted with emotion. Pain, regret, sorrow, and longing swirled within him like a tempest. He had never faced this, never seen his own children's hearts laid bare before him, trembling and fragile, yet demanding care. He felt something within him break, a dam that had held back decades of grief, anger, and misguided protection. He swallowed hard, his throat tight, and the first words he spoke in weeks were raw and hesitant. "Caleb, Silas." The sound of their names, spoken with hesitation and unfamiliar softness, made the room feel warmer than it had in years. Naomi's chest tightened, a mixture of relief and hope flooding her. She could feel the first threads of change weaving through the mansion, fragile but unbreakable. The rain outside continued its relentless drumming, but inside, a shift had occurred. The storm of fear, anger, and control had collided with courage, compassion, and love, and the result was undeniable. The walls of silence were cracking. Caleb's small body trembled, but he straightened slightly, his chin rising as if to say, "I'm not afraid anymore." Silas, feeling the courage radiating from his brother and the steadiness of Naomi, reached out his tiny hand, grasping at the air as if he could touch the security surrounding him. Harlan's breathing slowed, heavy but calmer. For the first time, he truly saw what he had been missing, the fragility, the hope, the resilience of the two little lives he had vowed to protect but had unknowingly frightened. Naomi whispered softly, a gentle affirmation to the children and a challenge to Harlan. "You can choose love over fear, Harlan. You can be the father they need. The choice is yours." For the first time in a long time, Harlan understood. He saw the consequences of his anger, the weight of his grief, and the possibility of redemption. The unexpected turning point had arrived, not in a boardroom or a confrontation, but in the quiet courage of a 5-year-old boy, the protective love of a sister-like caretaker, and the undeniable innocence of a baby who depended on them all. And in that moment, the mansion, long a house of fear and silence, began to breathe. The days following the storm were quiet, but heavy with reflection. Harlan retreated to his office, closing the door behind him, shutting out the world, and perhaps trying to shut out himself. The mansion, once a symphony of tension and fear, felt suspended in a fragile pause. Caleb and Silas wandered through the halls cautiously, their small steps echoing in a place that had grown strangely unfamiliar. The once ominous corridors now felt like waiting rooms for something uncertain, something they could not yet name. Harlan sat at his massive mahogany desk, his hands clasped together as though holding himself upright against a tidal wave of memories. He stared at the photographs of his wife, the children, the life he thought he had control over, and his chest ached with the weight of guilt. His body ached from tension he hadn't realized he was carrying, a tight knot in his stomach that seemed impossible to untangle. The anger, the discipline, the rigid control, it all felt hollow now, empty without the warmth of the family he had neglected. Naomi, aware of his retreat, approached carefully. Her steps were soft on the polished floor, but her presence was undeniable, a quiet force that had never bowed to Harlan's authority. She knocked gently, then entered without waiting for permission, carrying nothing but her unwavering resolve. "Help me," Harlan said, voice low and foreign on his tongue. It was a phrase he had not spoken in decades, a crack in the fortress he had built around himself. His eyes, red-rimmed and tired, searched Naomi's face for some anchor. Naomi's heart clenched. She had waited for this moment, had hoped for it, but the gravity of it still hit her. She took a careful step closer, offering neither judgment nor pity, only understanding. "I will," she said softly. Her chest rose and fell as she measured her words. "But you have to want it too. You have to choose to see them, not as extensions of your grief, but as your children." Harlan nodded slowly, shoulders sagging with a release of tension he hadn't realized he was holding. His chest still ached, but the sharp edge of his anger was softening, replaced by something fragile, something unfamiliar, awareness. For years, he had believed that fear was the only way to command respect, that control equaled love. Now he was beginning to understand that love demanded vulnerability. Caleb watched from the doorway, arms crossed, stomach twisting with a blend of hope and skepticism. He had seen his father storm through rooms, crush toys, and punish mistakes with words sharp as knives. Could this really be different? Could the man who had been a constant tempest in his life truly change? He clenched his fists, nails pressing into his palms, as he decided to wait and watch, his small heart oscillating between fear and anticipation. Silas, unaware of the complexity swirling around him, clutched a small stuffed bear to his chest. His eyes, wide and curious, followed Naomi's every movement. He had learned in his short life that security was fragile, that adults often disappointed, but Naomi had taught him that safety could exist, and perhaps for the first time he sensed that it might. Naomi guided Harlan through the first steps of reconciliation. She suggested small gestures, simple acts that carried immense weight, holding Silas close without strict instructions, listening to Caleb's words without immediate correction, acknowledging mistakes without anger. Each step was a battle against old habits, but also a declaration that change was possible. Harlan struggled. His voice, once booming with authority, now trembled with uncertainty. "I don't know if I can," he admitted one afternoon, sitting across from Naomi at the long dining table, hands fidgeting with a silver fork he didn't need. His eyes, usually sharp and commanding, were soft, almost pleading. Naomi leaned forward, her voice steady yet full of warmth. "You can. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to show them that you're trying. That's enough for now." Caleb, witnessing these moments, felt a small shift inside him. His chest, which had been tight with anxiety, loosened slightly. He began to notice the subtle changes, his father pausing before raising his voice, offering a hand instead of a rebuke, even smiling faintly at a joke Caleb made. The road to forgiveness was long, and the fear lingered, but the first steps had been taken. Harlan's nights were sleepless, haunted by the echo of his wife's absence and the memory of his children's fear. Yet, in the quiet darkness, he reflected on Naomi's words, her steadfast presence, and the bravery of a little boy who had stood against his anger. The realization struck him with painful clarity. He had been destroying the only family he had left, and if he didn't change, love would slip through his fingers forever. He began to reach out, first tentatively, Then, with growing confidence, he started by asking Caleb about his day, genuinely listening without interruption. He learned the importance of presence, of being there not as a ruler, but as a father. Silas responded instinctively, nestling into Harlan's arms, cooing as if recognizing the first flickers of trust. Naomi watched these moments, her chest swelling with quiet pride and hope. She had never been a savior. Her role was simpler, yet profound, to be a witness to courage, to guide with compassion, to show that change was possible. She moved through the mansion like a gentle current, steadying the atmosphere, softening the edges of fear and anger with each step. One evening, as stars shimmered beyond the towering windows, Caleb approached Naomi with a tentative smile. His eyes, bright and shining, reflected the newfound courage that had been nurtured within him. "Ah, I think he's trying," he whispered, voice barely audible, but filled with certainty. Naomi's lips curved in a gentle, warm smile. "Yes, Caleb. And that's the beginning of everything. Courage doesn't mean there's no fear. It means you keep going even when fear is there." Caleb nodded, a weight lifting from his small shoulders. Silas reached for his brother's hand, their fingers intertwining in a silent bond that spoke louder than words. Harlan, watching from the doorway, felt something stir deep inside, a fragile, trembling hope that perhaps, finally, he could be the father he had always wanted to be, if only he allowed himself to change. The mansion, once dominated by silence and fear, began to hum with life. Laughter was cautious at first, hesitant, but it grew steadily. Small victories, the brushing of hair, a shared meal, a bedtime story, became monumental acts of love. The children learned that safety could exist, that warmth could be genuine, and that fear did not have to rule their lives. Harlan, still haunted by the past, realized that redemption was a journey, not a destination. But with each day, each brave act, each moment of listening and presence, the walls that had once confined them all began to crumble. And in those cracks, light entered, fragile but persistent. Naomi, Caleb, Silas, and even Harlan found themselves navigating the delicate beginnings of a new reality. Courage, love, and hope intertwined, creating a foundation stronger than fear had ever been. The mansion no longer felt like a fortress of coldness. It became a home slowly, painfully, beautifully alive. And in that awakening, every heartbeat mattered, every glance counted, and every small act of love rippled through their lives like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Because even broken men can change, even frightened children can find courage, and even houses built on fear can become homes filled with love, if someone is willing to take the first step. The mansion, once cold and silent, now hummed with life. Every hallway, every room seemed to breathe, carrying the echoes of laughter, soft footsteps, and whispered conversations. The chandeliers no longer reflected only grandeur. They reflected warmth, flickers of hope, and the promise of connection. Harlan moved through the house cautiously at first, his shoulders still heavy, but his steps measured differently now. The power that once defined him no longer mattered. What mattered was presence, attention, love. He paused outside Caleb's room, listening to the soft sound of the boy talking to Naomi about a story they had read together. For the first time, Harlan felt that he was observing life rather than controlling it. Inside the room, Caleb's eyes shone bright, cheeks flushed with excitement as he recounted every detail. Silas, perched in Naomi's lap, clapped his tiny hands with glee. Naomi's voice was warm and steady, guiding, comforting, affirming every word and emotion. Her presence had transformed their world into something tangible, something alive. "Look, Silas," Caleb exclaimed, pointing at the illustrated page. "The dragon isn't scary at all. See how brave the knight is." His chest rose and fell with excitement, and even his small hands gestured wildly, knocking over a block tower he had built moments before. But instead of anger, Naomi laughed softly, brushing a stray lock of hair from his face. "Yes, Caleb, the knight is very brave, and so are you." Harlan, standing silently in the doorway, felt a lump rise in his throat. He had never heard anyone speak to his children like that. Words filled with affirmation, encouragement, and love instead of discipline. His chest tightened, and a tear threatened to fall, but he blinked it back. He wasn't sure he deserved to feel this, yet he couldn't look away. Over the following weeks, small changes became monumental milestones. Harlan learned to hold Silas close without stiff hands, to listen when Caleb spoke rather than preparing a reprimand, to accept mistakes without fury. Each gesture, each word, was a step toward mending the fractures in their lives. And Caleb, slowly but surely, began to trust again. One afternoon, as the sun streamed through the tall windows of the drawing room, Caleb approached Harlan hesitantly. His small fingers brushed against a book on the table, his eyes wide and uncertain. "Daddy, can you read with us?" he asked softly, voice trembling with the faintest hint of hope. Harlan swallowed, throat tight, and nodded slowly. "Yes, Caleb," he said, his voice rough but sincere. "Let's read together." Naomi watched silently from across the room, heart swelling with quiet pride. She had not done this for recognition or praise. She had done it because she believed in courage, in love, and in the possibility of change. And now, seeing Harlan bend, see, and listen, she knew that transformation was no longer an abstract hope. It was real. The children flourished in this new environment. Silas learned to laugh freely, his small hands reaching for affection without fear. Caleb's confidence grew with every shared story, every gentle affirmation, every act of understanding from his father. The mansion itself seemed to shift. Where once shadows lurked, sunlight now pooled on polished floors. Where once silence reigned, the sound of life echoed endlessly. Even Harlan felt the transformation within himself. He walked through rooms with awareness, sometimes pausing just to observe the simple joys he had long ignored. The smell of baked bread in the kitchen, the laughter of his sons chasing each other through corridors, the gentle hum of Naomi's lullabies, all became treasures he had never thought to notice. One evening, as stars glittered beyond the mansion windows, Caleb sat on the sofa, Silas nestled in his lap, and Naomi beside them. Harlan joined them, hesitating at first, then sliding onto the armchair next to the children. For a moment, they all sat together in silence, breathing in the warmth that had been absent for so long. Caleb leaned forward, eyes shining, and whispered, "I'm not scared anymore." His voice was soft but certain, a declaration that resonated deeper than any words Harlan had spoken in years. Naomi reached over, brushing Caleb's hair gently from his face. "Because now," she said softly, "someone finally listened." Her words, simple yet profound, hung in the air like a promise. Harlan felt something inside him loosen, a tension he hadn't realized had held him prisoner. He looked at Caleb, at Silas, at Naomi, and for the first time allowed himself to feel unguarded love, to accept that his presence, his attention, and his care could truly heal. From that night onward, the mansion no longer held only fear and silence. It held possibility, connection, and transformation. Harlan began to smile more freely, to laugh alongside his children, to engage with them rather than dictate to them. The boys learned that mistakes were not punishments but lessons, that love was abundant and unconditional, that courage could be found in the smallest acts of trust. Naomi, who had become far more than a caretaker, watched the family blossom around her. She had guided them, nurtured them, and above all, witnessed them rise from fear into hope. She often caught Caleb's shy, bright gaze, filled with gratitude and trust, and she felt the warmth of her efforts reflected in their joy. Harlan, reflecting on the journey, understood finally that power was not control, authority was not fear, and love was not given by fiat. It was earned through presence, compassion, and courage. The man who had once ruled with anger now learned to lead with empathy, to teach by example, to listen with patience. The mansion's halls, once echoing with the weight of grief and oppression, now resounded with laughter, with gentle reprimands softened by understanding, with the sound of a family learning to love one another. Caleb and Silas flourished under the care of a father who was learning every day, and Naomi, ever steadfast, remained the heart of their home, guiding and supporting with wisdom and warmth. And as the stars shimmered above the mansion, reflecting in the polished marble floors below, a profound truth settled over the household. Even in the deepest pain, even after years of fear, even when hearts had been broken, love could rebuild, courage could shine, and a new beginning was always possible. Because this was no longer just a mansion. It was home. A home where hearts were mended. A home where courage was nurtured. A home where love finally was heard. As the mansion finally echoed with laughter and warmth, Caleb and Silas learned that courage, love, and hope could truly change everything. Harlan discovered that being a father wasn't about control or fear. It was about presence, listening, and embracing every moment with his children. Naomi, the heart of the home, had shown that even the smallest acts of care and bravery could rebuild a family. This story reminds us that no matter how heavy the past feels, love has the power to heal, courage can shine through fear, and a new beginning is always possible. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to follow the channel for more tales that inspire, move, and remind us of the strength of the human spirit. Every story is a chance to feel, reflect, and believe in the power of change.